and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of everything happening in public policy and politics right here in North Carolina. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal, and please like and follow this. We're bringing it to you every week, everything that's happening in your state politics. Joining me this week with expert insight and analysis, we have Carolina Journal reporter Alex Baltziger. Been a busy week for you, of course. And from the John Locke Foundation, Mitch Kokai. Also, Carolina Journal reporter David Bass, covering all the education issues that we cover here at Carolina Journal. And of course, joining us again, great to see you, Jenna Robinson from the Martin Center for Academic Renewal. All right, let's jump right in. This week we had a record 6 gubernatorial overrides by both chambers of the state legislature this week. We've been following those really closely. Those bills that are becoming law are really sparking some passion, some big opinions on both sides. Republicans saying these are common sense measures, and Democrats calling them mean-spirited. We've got all the details for you right here. Alex, you were there. It's been a week of slow going and a really busy Wednesday this week at the General Assembly.
That's right. They went ahead and they got a bunch of members to come in and hold these override votes because if you remember, the supermajority margins are thin,
sure.
And so to override a vote, you need 3/5 of the people there. So they had just enough.
Right.
But yeah, they went ahead and knocked out all 6 override votes in both chambers.
Wow. So that's the first time both chambers have done that as opposed to just one.
That's right. Actually, earlier this year, the House knocked out 6 veto override votes in one day, but this is the first time that the Senate has done it, and it's the first time both chambers have done it in the same day, so it is a new record.
Sure. So give us a rundown of kind of what's now law in these.
Yeah, good question. So there were six override votes. 2 of these bills dealt specifically with what you could call transgender issues.
Okay.
One deals with child surgeries,
right.
and like puberty blocking drugs. That was House Bill 808. It basically bans children from receiving these types of life-altering surgeries.
Right.
Because that's become a bigger industry lately, and so lawmakers felt the need to go ahead and grapple with that. Another one is the Fairness in Women's Sports Act. And
right.
so what this does is it prevents biological male athletes from participating in female designated sports. And this will apply to, I believe, middle school, high school, and college athletics.
Right.
And it is in compliance currently with NCAA policy on this too, so there shouldn't be any confliction there. And a lot of people were supportive of this bill, but in the Senate, it fell along partisan lines. Last time, it had been bipartisan. One Democrat supported it, Senator Val Applewhite from Cumberland County. But she got a lot of blowback, which she actually talked to me about. She told me all about this blowback and pressure she was getting from her left and sort of outrage from people who were calling her terrible things. But ultimately, when it came down to the override vote, she actually went back and went ahead and voted with her party on that one. So that one was interesting.
Sure.
A couple of interesting supporters in the crowd for that one.
Okay.
There's a high school girl, actually she's recently graduated from high school, named Peyton McNabb.
Right.
And she's a volleyball player who was going up against a transgender, so a male athlete who was playing volleyball against her, got hit in the face quite hard, was concussed, and has experienced pretty severe symptoms since then. I believe they're ongoing symptoms.
Sure.
So she was in the crowd, and she was supportive of this bill for obvious reasons. Sylvia Hatchell, former UNC women's basketball coach and national champion. She won the 1994 national championship for women's basketball. And then I believe Prisha Mosley, she was in the crowd, but for House Bill 808, because she was she had underwent surgery as a minor to transition, and then she's experienced a bunch of problems with detransitioning, and she felt like she sort of got almost tricked or manipulated into doing it.
Right.
And so there's been pretty serious ramifications there. Those are the 2 transgender bills. There's also the Parents' Bill of Rights, which turned into slightly a transgender bill, just with this one little part, basically about parents wanted to know if their kids are changing their gender at school.
Right. Suffering from a gender dysphoria type.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like not changing their gender, maybe that's the wrong way
Right.
to say it, but changing their pronouns or changing their name or something like that.
Sure.
Parents wanted to know about this, but there's been some pushback on the left and from certain teachers, I guess, that this needs to be a private decision at school, private as in between the teachers and the kids.
As opposed to between the kids and the parents.
Exactly, and so
Right.
the Parents' Bill of Rights has a part in there that says, no, if this happens, you need to disclose it to the parents.
Okay.
And so that part got sort of wrapped up in debate
Right.
and became, one of the other transgender bills.
Sure.
So anyways, those were 3 of the bills that were on there. There was also something dealing with like building codes. That one was less controversial. There were more House Democrats, at least, that voted for that one.
Sure.
And then there were 2 bills that dealt with charter schools that Cooper had vetoed, and the legislature overrode both of those. And those both had slight bipartisan support in the House.
Sure.
And fell along partisan lines in the Senate.
All right. Yeah, Mitch, tell me what your thoughts are. We're going back to the Parents' Bill of Rights right now. This has been a long time coming, and we had one last session that didn't quite make it. What do you think is the catalyst for this?
Well, I think a lot of parents have been concerned that they didn't really know what's going on in the schools.
Sure.
I think COVID exacerbated that. Prior to COVID, there may have been a number of parents who had some concerns about what was happening in their schools, but a lot of them, I think, basically just assumed we send our kids to school, they learn things, it's good, and they didn't think much about it. But once they had a chance during COVID, while they were watching what was happening with their kids, saying, this is what they're teaching, I think that really spurred a lot more people to want to know more about what was happening. And an interesting piece, building off what Alex just said, is 3 of these bills ended up being branded by the political left as anti-LGBTQ.
Right.
But if you actually look at them, none of them were anti-LGBTQ. One was about ensuring that women don't have to participate in sports against guys. One was saying you can't have an operation that removes healthy organs or healthy tissue until you're 18 and are old enough to be able to make that decision. And then the third one was largely about making sure that parents know what's going on in the schools with the curriculum, what's being taught. They have a chance to have more input on what's happening with their child in their school. And one piece of that much larger bill said if your kid decides to call him or herself a her or him instead,
Sure.
that the parent needs to know about it. It's
Right.
not something you're going to hide from them. Yet the political left decided to brand all of these as anti-LGBTQ. They're hate bills. People who would sponsor them are terrible. People who hate gays and hate people who aren't just like them. That's not what any of these bills were. The other thing I'll note very briefly is most of these votes, when they came to the veto override, were basically along party lines. But there were a few Democrats who voted along with the Republicans. And on 2 of the bills, Democrats who initially voted no flipped the vote to yes. Garland Pierce did that on both the women's sports bill and the bill on banning the transition for an underage person.
Sure.
Michael Ray did that for that second bill, the sex
Right.
change bill.
Very interesting. So, Jen, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the women's sports bill. It's something I watch very closely as a mother of female athletes.
Right. Well, when it first was proposed, I was concerned that this was going to create a problem with the NCAA. So that was
Sure.
something I was looking into very carefully. And the NCAA rules are much more permissive than North Carolina's
Sure.
new bill. But what the NCAA doesn't do is put any restrictions on what universities can do or states can do in terms of defining their own teams. And so the NCAA does allow biologically male athletes to participate in women's sports as long as they have not gone through male puberty. In most cases, they're trying to follow like the Olympic standards.
Okay.
But they don't say anything to universities or to states that is prescriptive about what states and universities can do to kind of narrow that permission. And so right now, at least, unless the NCAA, makes a U-turn, everything is good. North Carolina's teams should be able to compete successfully. I know that's a really big deal to a lot of
Sure,
people
of
here in
course.
North Carolina. And so it was good to see that everything can go forward without having to do a lot of changes or implementations or anything that's going to be disruptive.
Of course. Now, Alex mentioned the ones that impact charter schools. You've been following that very closely on your beat for Carolina Journal. Tell me what your thoughts are about these two veto overrides that are now law.
Yeah, very interesting. So, yeah, there are two bills. The first one is basically it would create a commission for the approval of charter schools. So right now, if there's a new charter that wants to be created, it has to go to a vote of the State Board of Education.
Okay.
And basically what this bill does is just create a separate commission that would be responsible for up or down vote on those charters. So it's seen as kind of a way to streamline the charter creation process. And I should mention a reason for that bill and for the other one is that there's actually a wait list right now of 77,000 students waiting to try to get into charter schools. So there's demand for these charters, and that's kind of one of the reasons why a lot of these bills are being brought forth. And then the second bill basically relates a lot to, it was an omnibus charter bill. It had various components in it, but one of the biggest ones was it would allow county governments to use taxpayer dollars to fund the building of charter schools, the actual capital construction projects, which previously they weren't allowed to do that. So again, it's just another way to kind of expand charters, expand the availability to meet the demand that's arisen.
Sure. So, I mean, there is a market. You just mentioned 77,000 families are waiting to get into charter schools. Was there a need? Are they finding resistance in the communities to developing them? Because it seems like a charter school board wouldn't be needed if they weren't.
Yeah, I think it's obviously a lot of it's political, you know, depending on where you fall in those camps. I think the one clear voice is the voice of parents in these communities that really want these expanded options, not just the charters, but private. Obviously, many families have chosen homeschooling as well. And still, many families choose the public school as well. So it's not one, is better than the other. It's just about having the options. And I think parents are really have been demanding that.
Sure.
And Donna, if anyone's concerned about the growth of bureaucracy and another board, this board that would be approving charter schools is actually a board that already exists, that has been an advisory board. And basically you're changing the name from the Charter School Advisory Board to the Charter School Review Board. And instead of having that group make a recommendation to the State Board of Education, now that group is going to be the one to decide. And if someone doesn't like what happens with that board, they can appeal to the State Board of Education. But the State Board of Education really just has now an appellate role rather than being the one that makes the ultimate decision. So it's a board that's already been taking part in the process, does all of the legwork, and now they get to make the ultimate decision. So it's not creating new bureaucracy.
Well, one of the things that's come up a lot is this role of if a charter school is struggling or failing, what happens then? And will this board have a role in that?
Well, they certainly do when they set the rules about what's going to be in the charter. Because remember, if you're a charter school, part of the name is you have a charter and you have to live up to your charter. And so the State Board of Education still ultimately could say that a charter is going to be revoked, which we should all remember is something that doesn't happen with the traditional public schools that fail year after year after year. Usually what happens is someone says, let's give them more money. So let's put more money in these schools that have been failing. If a charter school fails year after year after year, someone could say, let's get rid of their charter, and they shut down, which is a good thing. You want the charter schools to be successful, but the ones that aren't successful, you want to be able to shut them down as quickly as possible, unlike the traditional public schools that are just going to go on and on and on and have more money shoveled into them.
Sure. And Alex, you're probably hearing this from lawmakers too. People are abandoning some of the traditional public schools in favor of things like charter. So do you see more of a trend toward that in legislation?
Definitely, and we're going to see that in this upcoming budget. And they held a press conference earlier this year. They've had two bills in opposite chambers that expands the opportunity scholarship to everyone and allows basically what we commonly refer to as school choice. And so there is definitely a desire for that type, just to spark some sort of competition in education amongst public schools, private schools, charter schools, just to hold them accountable in some senses. Because if you don't have this sort of competition, at least this is the idea, and parents don't get to have any choice in where their kids are going, where is the accountability in that?
Right. It seems like accountability, Jen, I'll come back to you for this, especially when parents are choosing different options. They're homeschooling, they're using charter schools, private, but then that puts a challenge on the university to compare apples and apples in admission. Do you think that this move towards school choice and charter schools has created a little bit of a dilemma at the universities, or do you think they're ready for it?
I think that they could easily be ready for it by simply using standardized tests. That's what standardized tests are for. It's right there in the name, right? The
Sure.
SAT and the ACT apply the same no matter where you went to school, no matter what your preparation looks like. And so right now we are still in a pause from COVID, if you can believe it, on using the ACT and the SAT for admissions to our UNC institutions. But I think that it would be very easy for them to say, nope, the next admission cycle, we're gonna bring it back, because that does allow you to compare across different types of schools, regardless of what a student's background has been like. And I think that's very important, because even if you're just comparing public schools, there's a huge difference between a rural public school and an urban public school and a suburban public school.
Sure.
And you don't necessarily know that the history course is exactly the same across all those schools. And so I do think that standardized testing plays a huge role, and that's the direction that our schools should go in.
Very interesting. My children, all three, went to all different types of schools, and so we think about that when we're getting ready to apply to colleges. Lots of families are. But actually, this brings me to my next question. We saw the Supreme Court decision come up. I know you've been working very hard on this for UNC, Harvard and UNC, the Supreme Court denying the use of race-based admission standards. Tell me what you're seeing since that decision has come out from UNC.
Right, so UNC's response has actually been really fantastic. It's been so good to see. We saw statements first from Peter Hans, who is the president of the UNC system, and then from Chair David Bullock, who is the chair of the trustees at UNC Chapel Hill. Kevin Guskowitz, chancellor at UNC, his statement was a little bit more down the middle. He said he was disappointed, but they're going to follow it. And then the trustees followed all of that up with a resolution on anti-discrimination, saying they're not going to discriminate based on any protected categories for admissions, for hiring, or for contracting, which goes further than the Supreme Court ruling. And then in addition to that, we've seen news from the provost saying that the admissions office will now be blind to a person's race when they look at the application. The only way they could possibly figure it out is if it happens to turn up in an essay. And UNC has done a really good job, so none of its essays now kind of prime students to talk about race. A student might still talk about race in an essay. That's a student's prerogative to do so, but none of the essays kind of nudge a student to talk about race, which is really different from Harvard, because Harvard has a brand new question that is mandatory for everybody to answer, saying, Harvard values diversity. Please tell us how you can bring diversity to Harvard. Which is, this is, I think, a proxy for race-based admissions, and I do expect that to get litigated in the future. Very
interesting. So what are your thoughts on this, David? We've talked a lot about this decision.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's interesting because it relates to issues of race and discrimination and that sort of thing. But there are also other categories, I think, if you look at with college admissions, where there is, there could be some discriminatory practices going on. If you're, for example, at Harvard, there were some stats I saw where it was if you look at the percentage of students who are from rural areas who are attending Harvard, it's not very good at all. Even socioeconomically, looking at other categories like that. So race is one thing to look at, but if you want true diversity on your campus, it should encompass other categories as well.
Sure, absolutely. We've been following this a lot, Mitch. You follow all of the court cases. Do you anticipate this to be relitigated, something to come back up?
Oh yeah, it's certainly going to happen because there are going to be a lot of schools, and we don't know whether this is going to be true of UNC, Chapel Hill, or Harvard, although Jenna suggested that Harvard's already looking at how to get around this. But there are going to be other elite schools as well that'll say, we like things exactly the way they are now. The Supreme Court has put up a roadblock, but how do we get around the roadblock? And they're going to be looking for other ways to get the same sort of makeup of their student body that they have now. And one thing that's been discussed, there have already been some reports among people who were happy to see the Supreme Court rule the way that it did, but they were already looking ahead to what are these schools going to do now to try to get around it. And one negative possibility would be that they lower standards, that they steer even more away from the standardized tests that Jenna was talking about that are so valuable in telling you how well prepared people are. And one of the things that we learned in this litigation that I think a lot of people hadn't thought of is that the discrimination that was being done in favor of particular groups in admissions actually hurt them. because it was letting people into a class at elite schools. This is not really true of all schools, but at elite schools, it's letting people into the class who didn't have the preparation that they would need to succeed at these elite schools. And so they were more likely to fail. They were more likely to take a longer time to graduate. They were the ones who were coming out of college, whether with a degree or not, in a much worse shape than their classmates. And they would have been much better served going to a different college where their academic preparation put them in a good place to succeed. And so this is the type of thing where this was a form of discrimination done to benefit a particular group and actually hurt that group,
Sure.
in addition to keeping out students who otherwise would have qualified.
Sure, Alex. But we can't discount the value of diversity on campus, diversity of thought, having more veterans, having people from different types of communities, races. Everything is valuable to a well-rounded education.
Right, and I think affirmative action sort of allowed them to get some sort of diversity that they were looking for, without having to specifically only judge people on merit.
Right.
And so I think this is a significant hurdle for them to have to find another way to get the sort of composition that they want.
Right.
Which I think is what they're aiming for in a lot of ways. But yeah, it will be interesting to see what they end up doing. But there's a lot of interesting ways to do that. And one way to get diversity of thought is the new school at UNC of I believe it's Civic Life and Leadership.
That's
right.
That's right.
The right name. So they're starting this school basically like a free speech, free thought type of idea where they're going to have a lot more classes there. And that should be
I'm looking forward to hearing what happens with that. You mentioned something about the Biden administration, how they're handling it.
Right.
Tell me what you think.
So the Biden administration came out with guidance earlier this week, and all of it is, of course, it is correct to the letter of the law, but I think a lot of it is not following the spirit of the new ruling, because it is basically telling universities you can still ask about race in your admissions questions.
So it's the hack. Right?
Absolutely. But I mean, this is something that Roberts anticipated and talked about in his decision. He said something that cannot be done directly cannot be done indirectly.
Sure.
You may not use these essay questions as a proxy for something that we have decided is unlawful. And so that is why I'm very confident that it will be relitigated.
Sure.
And it was disappointing to see OCR and the Biden administration come out with this. Because OCR in other ways has been an honest broker. They will tell universities to stop when they are giving scholarships based on race or opening programs to students just based on race or having any other kind of race preferences in the programming at school. And so it was disappointing to see that.
Sure, absolutely. All right, we're going to be watching that really closely. I'm actually going to switch over to Mitch. We're going to talk a little bit about another piece of news out this week. The state legislature moving some pretty big changes in election law. That piece of legislation going, I think, to rules is where it's still sitting. Alex, you probably know that, but I think that's where it is right now. Mitch, bring us up to date on what that election bill says.
Well, the bill that you're talking about, because there are a couple of different elections bills, the bill you're talking about actually got through the General Assembly. They didn't just do the 6 veto overrides. They actually finished this bill, Senate Bill 747. And this deals with a number of election reforms. It first came out in the Senate at the beginning of June. Has more than 20 pieces to it, has a lot of interesting things, but the two main items that had been discussed at that time were getting rid of this 3-day grace period for absentee ballots to be mailed in. Since 2009, the law had been as long as the absentee ballot arrived within 3 days of Election Day, it would still count.
Right.
We saw that then run through 3 major election cycles, 2012, 2016, and 2020. And really over the last 2 cycles, I think there had been more concern from people that we don't really know in some cases on election night what happened, because we still have all these ballots that still could be counted, and we weren't sure how many of them there would be. And so there was a sense, and the John Locke Foundation has done a lot of work on this, saying, look, let's bring North Carolina back in line with 30 other states where Election Day is the last day. And so your mailed-in ballot has to be in by the close of polls on Election Day. That was one of the key pieces of the original Senate bill. Another one was, if you're going to be engaged in same-day voter registration that you have to cast a provisional ballot, which is different than the normal ballot. You cast this ballot, it goes into a separate pool, and then the elections officials approve that you are someone who's eligible to vote, and then they count your ballot. This bill kind of sat around for a while before the House took it up, but it was clear from what happened this week that it isn't just the House taking the Senate's plan and saying, we like this, we don't like this. They had been negotiating with the leading senators. Senator Warren Daniel was one of the people who, as this bill came up in the House, spoke to the various committees and said, hey, we like what you're doing, this is good. So it's obvious that both sides had been working on this and had come up with a deal. And once the House version came out, that piece about Election Day being the last day remained. Nothing of that changed. The piece about the same day registration changed in that you're not going to have to cast a provisional ballot, but it has to be what's called a retrievable ballot, in that there's some sort of marking on the ballot that will allow election officials, if they determine that you aren't an eligible voter, they can pull it back. And so it won't count. The other major change that happened between the Senate and the House is on something that has been very common and a lot of us engage in, which has been officially called one-stop, no-excuse, absentee balloting. But everyone calls it early voting. And the reason that this House bill is much longer than the Senate bill is it goes through everywhere in the state laws where it says something about no excuse, absentee ballot, and changes it to early voting. It's going to be called early voting.
For everything, yes.
It's not going to be something that no one understands anymore. It's going to be early voting. And as part of that, they're going to make the early voting a lot more like Election Day voting, too. So that happens. And there are some other pieces that have attracted attention. A lot of the criticism about this bill has dealt with election observers. We know that both parties have observers. Both major parties have observers that they send to the polls, and the bill kind of relaxes what those observers could do. They rather than sitting in a corner the whole time, they're allowed to move around a little bit and kind of monitor what's going on. That had drawn some flack from some people saying, wait a minute, we don't want them to be intimidating people. And so the bill changed from the time that it was in the Senate to the time that it was in the House on that front. There's also the piece about banning Zuck bucks, banning private funding of election administration. There was the one Democratic amendment that was added to the bill in the House was one that said, no, you can't take these Zuck bucks, but it'd be okay for someone to bring in some pizza or other food or some pens or the personal protection equipment for people working at the polls. And that bill that amendment got a vote of, I think, 113-3. So that was one change. But this is a major piece of legislation. It goes now to Governor Roy Cooper. I think almost everyone expects that because it was a party line vote, it's likely to be vetoed, so we'll have a chance to see more veto overrides before all's said and done.
Sure. So, Alex, you've been down there this week. Tell me what the reaction is among the legislatures, members, because when we talk about both sides had a deal, really talking about the Republican House, Republican Senate, not really Democrats, because they seem to be objecting to it early on.
That's right, and it seems like, I think towards the beginning of session, there were usually a couple of Senate Democrats who were voting with Republicans on certain bills, but that seems to have fallen by the wayside, at least recently. I have not seen Senate Democrats voting with Republicans. And now you are seeing House Democrats, a handful here and there voting with Republicans on bills. And I don't know what's happened there, but the Senate Democrats they seem to have sort of coalesced, and maybe that's something to do with Republicans having an outright supermajority, so they don't even really need to be earning their votes. But that's just an interesting note.
And an interesting piece on that, all of those votes that took place Wednesday in the Senate were 27-18. There were 3 Republicans who weren't there and 2 Democrats who weren't there. And among the 2 Democrats was their leader, Dan Blue. He wasn't there for any of it. The veto override and any other bill. So that was kind of interesting.
That is interesting. All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for this week. Thanks so much for joining us. You can check out carolinajournal.com and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get all the updates. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great weekend.